Okay. We are now in Volume 3, Part 3, so aka Volume 10. The prologue. Fran's master Rosemind returned from the castle she did not feel comfortable there yet, since she had just risen from being a commoner to the Archduke's adopted daughter. But as she returned to her own chambers to enjoy some tea, the anxiousness in her expression instantly melted away. Fran, who had prepared the tea, took this to mean that she wanted to relax, and thus took a step back. So Fran, what do you think about me getting more attendance? Rosemind asked out of nowhere. Fran forced a slight smile as his mind raced to process the question. He needed to work out what had led Rosemind to ask this before giving an answer, otherwise his young master would surely charge in a ridiculous direction as she had done so many times in the past. Fran would never forget the time she had attempted to take on every single orphan as an attendant just to give them an excuse to leave the orphanage. Lady Rosemind, may I ask where this question is coming from? Fran replied. I was talking to Wilma, and she mentioned that I don't have as many attendants as I should for someone serving as a poor woman, an orphanage director, and the High Bishop. I had assumed that this was a normal number of attendants for a High Bishop, but now I realize that everyone's workload is just too much. Wilma was correct. Rosemind had 5 attendants, but as Nicola and Monica were often in the kitchen helping the chefs, they were not yet doing the proper work of an attendant. This meant that her 3 other attendants were currently handling almost all the work, which was simply unreasonable. But Fran knew Rosemind's finances better than anyone, and it had been at his suggestion that she had taken on both Nicola and Monica to replace Delia. He couldn't ask her to take on even more attendants on top of that. I spoke to Ferdinand about getting more attendants as well, Rosemind continued. Fran leaned forward a bit. Ferdinand the High Priest was his former master, but since Fran was still carrying out his order to regularly report back on Rosemind, he couldn't help but feel that Ferdinand continued to be his master in part. Sort of. Sorry. At certain times and places, he would even prioritize Ferdinand's orders and views over Rosemind's, especially in regard to matters concerning reading or her health. What did the High Priest say? Fran asked. He said it was up to me to determine whether things are progressing smoothly. I can increase my number of attendants if they aren't, but otherwise I don't need to, Rosemind replied. But with all the money I'm making, my pay as the High Bishop, and the child support that Karstead and Sylvester are giving Ferdinand for taking care of me at my disposal, I think we should take on more attendants if we think we can manage it. It seems that we're so free of money problem right now that my decision here really is enough to make it happen. Do you agree that we should take on more? Now that Fran knew she had permission from Ferdinand, he could finally relax and think over the actual matter at hand. I would also advise increasing the number of workshop administrators, he said. Gil is largely running the workshop by himself at the moment, but he will often need to be absent from the temple as we establish new workshops like the one in Haas. With that in mind, I think we will need at least one Grey Priest to manage the workshop alongside him. Establishing new workshops would always involve the Gilberta Company, and in cases where they asked for workshop employees to be sent over, Gil would always be selected due to how much time he had spent with them. And since the workshop's location in the boys' building made it difficult for women to manage, Fran would need to do all of Gil's work until he returned. They really were in dire need of more male attendants. Okay, I shall ask Gil and Liz to select one of the Grey Priests from the workshop, Rosemind replied. After all, whoever takes this position will need to work well with them. She had taken Fran's advice without a second thought and was entrusting the selection of the new attendant to Gil and Lutz. That was unusual as well as far as Fran was concerned. When it came to selecting new attendants, she had always prioritized the opinion of her existing attendants over her own. Ferdinand, on the other hand, selected his attendants through brutal meritocracy. Whenever he selected a new person, he would take on 10 at once and immediately pile work on them. From there, he would send them back to the orphanage one by one the moment he determined they were not good enough. Well, with that decided, how will we select the new attendant for the orphanage, Rosemind asked. There will be no need. You entrusted the orphanage to Wilma so that she could continue living there, taking care of the young children who had been abandoned in the basement without Grey Shrinemen and caretakers. But to begin with, it is not normal for the orphanage to have any such administrator at all. If you have multiple attendants there working as administrators, the next orphanage director will surely encounter problems upon your retirement, Fran explained. Ferdinand had said that Rosemind would continue to be involved in temple business until she came of age. It was hard to imagine that the orphans would continue to receive such thorough care when this happened, since the next orphanage director would most likely be unwilling to take on several attendants just to manage them. It was true that Rosemind had brought much change to the orphanage, but nobody wanted to reach a point where her successor would be unable to do their job. Fran's explanation made Rosemind clap her hands together in realization. Now that he mentioned it, I took on Wilma as an attendant purely for my own reasons and put her in charge of the orphanage on my own. She had apparently forgotten all about the circumstances in which Wilma was hired, likely because she was doing such a good job managing the orphanage. What about my high bishop duties, then? Rosamond continued. I think we need more help than there than anywhere else. If you could take on someone who is already capable, much like the high priest attendants are, then that would be very much appreciated. But we have no need for an untrained attendant who must be educated. Monica is very intelligent and a hard worker, and we can worry about hiring new apprentice attendants once she's fully trained, Fran replied honestly. He appreciated that Rosamond was trying to decrease his workload, but his hands were already full enough training Monica and Nicola. Rosamond gave a small, disappointed smile, and here I was hoping to decrease your workload a little, Fran. And Fran was glad that his master cared enough to try. As he savored the joy flowing from his heart, he thought about the current state of the High Bishop's chambers, and why the training of the two new recruits was not going so well. He found an answer immediately. It was quite simply the fact that Monica and Nicola were spending so much time in the kitchen, which wasn't somewhere attendants were supposed to be. What Rosamond needed wasn't new attendants for her High Bishop's chambers, but new chefs instead. Lady Rosamond, could you hire new chefs? Fran asked. What used to be done by Hugo, Todd, and Ella is now only being done by Ella, which is a bit unreasonable. Furthermore, Monica and Nicola are cooking while you are absent, but that is not work attendants should be doing. It would be a considerable help if you were to hire chefs who could remain in the temple when you leave for the castle. Monica and Nicola had been taken on as attendants for helping Ella while Rosamond was stuck in the temple for the winter, so they had continued to work in the kitchen as a matter of habit. But if doing this was causing problems for their attendant work, then there was little point in taking them on as attendants at all. As Fran pointed that out, Rosamond cratered her head, realizing that cooking was indeed not the work of an attendant. She was doing her best to act as a noble would, but her emotions were so transparent at times that it was clear how vulnerable she still was. Fran could see Bridget suddenly move her head to the side so as to pretend not to see Rosamond clearly acting like a commoner. Damian noticed this as well, and since he knew that Rosamond was of commoner origin, he quickly spoke to Bridget to draw her attention away. Frank, I would ask Benno to send us new chefs again so that we may train them for the Italian restaurant as well. That should solve the problem. Rosamond said, her noble facade having returned by the time she raised her head. Fran had expected that she would recover quickly, and it was because she was already so aware of her faults that he did not boorishly inform her of the mistake. That will give us some more chefs, but Nicola really enjoys working in the kitchen, doesn't she? Rosamond asked. I have a feeling that's where she'll be the most happy, so rather than having her quit, I believe it will be better if we allow her to keep helping in the kitchen and simply train another attendant in her place. No other noble in Arrynvest would allow their apprentice attendant to help in the kitchen, no matter how much they enjoyed it. But the glimmer in Rosamond's golden eyes made it clear that she had already come to a conclusion, and ultimately it was down to her to decide what work to give her attendants. I shall entrust that decision to you, Lady Rosamond. In that case, I shall be going to the workshop. I would like to ask Lutz and Gil to select the new attendant. And so Fran sent Monica to the workshop to inform them of their visit before taking Rosamond there alongside her guard knight Daniel. It was getting colder as the autumn came to a close, but due to all the people, the workshop was much warmer than the temple halls. Everyone was working on finishing the year's last batch of paper, to the point that their hands were turning red. Lady Rosamond, Gil and Lutz said, rushing over upon seeing her. Rosamond promptly began explaining the need to hire another attendant to manage the workshop. Fran couldn't help but smile. He could tell that she was choosing her words carefully to ensure that Gil did not feel his position was being threatened. His master remained the same at heart, even after being adopted by the Archduke. Gil, I intend to make more workshops in the future, as we are doing in Haas. Each time I do, you will need to leave the temple, will you not? I would like the two of you to recommend to me a great priest who you would feel comfortable entrusting with the workshop. They will need to be capable of doing business with the Gilberta Company, so it should ideally be someone you're on good terms with. Does anyone come to mind? The two boys looked around the workshop and thought, before each coming to their own conclusion and suggesting names. Fritz or Bart should work, Lutz suggested. Nolt or Fritz can handle it, if I may make a suggestion, Gil said. They had both listed Fritz, so Fran thought back to what he knew about him. He was a great priest who had previously served as an attendant to the blue priest Shikikoza, before he climbed the towering staircase. Oh my god! Before his return to noble society, Shikikoza had been an especially self-centered master, and for that reason, Fran had once mused that Fritz must have had a supremely patient personality. Oh, definitely. You'd have to be able to be dealing with someone like that. Fritz's experience as a former attendant also meant that he knew proper manners, so he would be able to work in both the workshop and the High Bishop's chambers. Lady Rosamond, I believe it will be wise to take Fritz as an attendant, Fran said. And so she decided to take Fritz on as an attendant so that he may help manage the workshop once his chambers had been prepared, While Nicola shall continue to assist the chefs, Fran said, reporting back to Ferdinand in his high priest chambers, as he always did. Lady Rosemine will also be speaking to the Gilberta Company about the possibility of us receiving new chefs to be trained. Fran noticed Ferdinand's eyebrow twitch upon hearing that Rosemine wished to continue letting Nicola work in the kitchen. But Fran continued regardless. He had been trained to prioritize finishing his reports over everything else. I find it disagreeable that she would make an apprentice attendant do such lowly work. She is not planning to purchase her as a chef and move her to the servants' quarters, is she? I believe she intends to allow Nicola to continue doing chef work while being accommodated as an attendant. I do not believe there will be any issue with this. However, just as Sister Christine had her attendants focus on artistic work such as music, performance, and composition, it is plausible, albeit much rarer, for an attendant to do chef work for amusement, Fran said in her defense. Ferdinand raised an eyebrow in surprise. It seems that Rosemine has poisoned your mind a great deal, he said in a sincerely worried tone. Fran looked down at his hands. It wasn't something that he was very aware of, but he was no doubt being influenced by Rosemine in more ways than one. He couldn't remain unchanged from the days where he had served Ferdinand. Regardless, from what I can tell, the burden on you has been quite significant for some time now, Ferdinand continued. If you need the assistance, I can transfer one of my attendants to you. I very much appreciate the offer, High Priest, but that would ultimately just increase your own burden, Fran responded, declining the kind gesture. Ferdinand shook his head. I have more leeway than usual now that I have less work to do in the castle. In fact, I now have enough time to train new attendants alongside Camphor and Freetic. So you will do well to instruct Rosemine to request one of mine. This extra leeway was entirely thanks to Rosemine, so Fran found it very heartwarming that Ferdinand had chosen to use it for her sake. And as Fran continued to happily muse over this, Ferdinand's brow wrinkled in a slight smile. Both you and Rosemine worry only about others, Fran. Does a servant take after the master, I wonder? Probably. Lady Rosemine once said the same thing to me before, Fran said, remembering the time that she had called him a serious and stubborn hard worker just like Ferdinand. Hearing that made Ferdinand visibly grimace. Back when Fran had served him, such clear shows of emotion had been exceedingly rare for him. It seems that I am not the only one having my mind poisoned by Lady Rosemine. Oh, definitely. Yeah, she's influencing them both. Ingo and improving the printing press. Lady Rosemine, Les has brought a letter from the Gilberta Company, Gil said, holding out a letter once he had finished today's bed report. I took the letter feeling a bit confused. It wasn't often that I received a proper letter from them. I would usually just ask Gil or Les to tell Benno to call me over whenever he had the time, or alternatively, they would approach me to say that Benno wanted to see me. As such, we almost always handled things through direct communication. Did something happen, I wondered as I opened the letter? A quick scan revealed that it was an official request for a meeting from the Gilberta Company, and that they wanted to bring Ingo to my hidden room to discuss improving the printing press. This isn't good. I wondered what I should do. The fewer people who knew who I was, the better. While I was aware that Benno would only send this letter if he deemed it absolutely necessary for us to meet in person, I didn't know Ingo very well at all, nor did I feel comfortable bringing him into my hidden room to talk. I mumbled to myself, then hurriedly placed a hand over my mouth. Putting on a smile in an attempt to recover from my blunder, I looked up at Gil, who was waiting my response. Gil, tell Lutz that I would like to discuss this matter in more detail before replying to the letter. As you wish, he replied. I spoke to Lutz in my hidden room the next day. He had come over as soon as Gil delivered my request. So Lutz, why does Ingo want to speak to me? Weren't we going to have him improve the printing press with help of the Grey Priest? I asked. They must have encountered some kind of problem while attempting to discuss it on their own. Ingo came to the workshop when we talked about improving it, but Lutz began. The printing press process in the workshop was currently as simple as they could possibly be. The letter types were lined up within the form, which was locked into place in a box-like structure. The form was then slattered with ink and paper was set on top, at which point one would place the box between the printing plate and press down. We have made these by slightly modifying normal presses, but they still weren't much different from the ones used to juice fruit and the like. There was a generic stand next to each printing press where the ink and paper was placed. Under ideal circumstances, the stand for the form and paper would be pushed and pulled to slide into place beneath the printing press. But we had to do all that by hand, which made it a fairly poor printing press, all things considered. As a result, we had decided to have the Grey Priests think of potential improvements as they got used to working with them. During their discussion, Lutz had apparently suggested that Ingo make the printing press closer to the complete design I had mentioned before. Ingo had listened with a confident grin at first, but by the end of Lutz's long explanation, he was angrily demanding to speak to whoever could provide more details. He was real mad, yelling about how he didn't want to have to go through loads of unnecessary trial and error if someone already knew what the finished product was supposed to look like. That didn't bother me, but the Grey Priests weren't used to how rough a craftsman can be, so they all got too scared to talk anymore. It was all a big mess. But honestly, I see where Ingo was coming from, Lutz said with a defeated shrug. I personally didn't think that trial and error would have been a waste, since they might have been able to make a printing press better than the one I was familiar with. But it was harder to argue when the craftsman himself wanted more details. Believe me, I told Ingo that you couldn't go outside like you used to, and that it wouldn't be easy to get him in a room with you for a conversation. But he told me that there was no reason that you wouldn't be able to talk to a person from the lower city if you really wanted to, since you used to walk all around as a weird rich girl. In other words, you're already talking to me about it, so there wasn't really anything I could say back. Ingo had apparently been quite insistent that if I could talk to Lutz about the printing press, despite him being a commoner, that I could obviously talk to him, the actual craftsman, as well. Ingo knew me back from when I had traveled with Benno and Lutz to his workshop to make orders, and in his mind I was a rich person, capable of talking to lower city craftsmen without any issues, whether I was a noble or not. Still, it was rare for someone so familiar with the danger that nobles posed to not back down after thinking that. I would have thought that a normal craftsman wouldn't prod a noble so deeply. Is this really okay? They normally wouldn't, but he's gotta finish every job you give him to as good a standard as possible. He's pretty desperate about this, since it'll play such a big part in his future, Let's said. Ingo had started his own carpentry workshop at a very young age after getting his Baruch certification, and was just a little older than Benno at 33. There were some foremen who ended up in charge of a workshop due to inheritance or marriage, but most who started their own were 40 or older. Ingo, being in his early 30s, put him far below the average, which meant he wasn't treated with much respect in the Carpenter Guild. No major jobs were ever sent his way. That was why he was desperate to earn the Guild's approval here. I was becoming increasingly famous as the High Bishop, capable of giving real blessings, so exclusively giving him my business would completely change his standing within the Guild. Wait, aren't I already exclusively giving him my business, I asked? I had assumed this was already the case, since I had given him all my orders for winter handiwork, wood, and the printing presses. At this point, I was already considering him as one of my Gutenbergs. Let's cross his arms. It's a tough call. When it came to Haas's monastery, you placed your order directly with the Carpentry Guild through Master Benno and the Guildmaster, remember? We didn't have much of a choice, since finishing things quickly was our highest priority, but normally you should have spoken to Ingo first and had him delegate the work to other workshops. I had ordered the carpentry work for Haas's monastery under the High Bishop's name. Benno and Gustav had gotten to the Carpentry Guild to discuss the matter, both acting as my representatives, and since they hadn't even had time to iron out who was giving who exclusive business, they just allowed the Guild to organize everything themselves. Ingo, however, hadn't been among my representatives. It was supposed to be his job to organize the work as the foreman I exclusively gave my business to, but as he hadn't heard about the task until the Guild mentioned it to him, they had started to question whether he really was the only workshop I gave business to. We had been able to finish the monastery in time thanks to giving our order directly to the Carpentry Guild, but as a result, Ingo's status was being called into question. They think you've hired him for work in the past, but either didn't like the results or just plan on using other workshops as well, Les explained. That was the kind of interpretation that could mean life or death for a craftsman, so it wasn't strange to think he'd risked some personal danger to secure my exclusive business. And since this was a problem that had occurred due to me prioritizing speed and efficiency over everything else, it was my responsibility to restore Ingo's now damaged reputation. Okay, I'll speak to him here, I replied. They won't like me meeting with an associate from my mine days who doesn't know the circumstances behind me becoming Rose Mine, but I would like to talk to him personally about this matter if possible. It would certainly be ideal to hear how Ingo intended to improve the printing press from the man himself. Plus, since he was willing to take on the risk of dealing with nobles, I thought it only fair that I repair his bravery. I sent a response to the Gilberta Company's request for a meeting, and on the scheduled day, Benno and Lutz came to my orphanage director's chambers with Ingo. He had cleaned himself up from head to toe in preparation for meeting a noble, so the person before me was nothing like the sweaty man with the scraggly beard that I had remembered. I hadn't seen his hair back at the workshop since there had been a towel wrapped around his head like a bandana, but now I could see that his hair was ochre and his eyes bright blue. Coupled with the nice outfit that had replaced his usual dirty work clothes, he was like a completely different person from the guy in the workshop. Benno gave his long, noble greetings, and I replied in turn. Meanwhile, Ingo kept kneeling in silence. He had never done business with a noble before, and thus had no idea what to say, as would be the case for most craftsmen. Now then, shall we move things to the back room, I asked. As you wish, Benno replied, giving Ingo a slap on the shoulder once the door had closed behind us. All right, Ingo, you can talk in here. Lady Rosemine will turn a blind eye to whatever's said in this room, so you don't have to be perfect with your language. But take care not to be too rough or in her face. That's good to hear. I had no friggin' idea what to say back there, Ingo admitted with a sigh, but then he turned to look at me, a serious glint in his bright blue eyes. They were strong eyes, filled with the resolve to stand strong despite his fear and distrust of nobles. Now, girlie, High Bishop, there's one thing I want to ask. It's something really important. Is my workshop the only carpentry workshop you plan to do business with? I would like to think so. When it came time to work in Haas, we were so pressed for time that we went directly to the Carpentry Guild, which has regrettably made life difficult for you. But in general, the work you provide is more than satisfactory. All right then, Ingo said, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders as he let out a sigh of relief. It seemed that he had really been driven into a corner by this whole situation, and I couldn't help but feel responsible. But before I could say anything else to him, Ingo spun his shoulder once and looked at me head-on, giving the hard look of a craftsman brokering a deal. In that case, I'm going to ask you to tell me everything you know about how to improve the printing press. I want to make the best thing possible here. His eyes made his request clear. He wasn't going to settle for anything less than the best, and if I knew how to make that happen, then I should just tell him. But my knowledge from my Arano days told me that even the initial printing press that Gutenberg had made from a great press was improved slowly over time until it was eventually a large metal contraption. The printing press in our workshop was made entirely of wood, and it was very likely that we wouldn't be able to keep up with Gutenberg's advancements unless that changed. How much could we improve the printing press here, really? I just tried to remember what the printing press in the Plantin Moretus Museum looked like. It came from the oldest printing workshop that had ever existed, so I wanted to improve our printing press up to that point at the very least. But I didn't know enough to draw up a detailed blueprint. At the moment, we put paper on the box with the form inside, then place it directly beneath the printing plate, correct? Well, it could be a lot easier to use if we could attach a stand like this to it, which we could just push and pull. The printing press that I know has a handle on the side that you could turn to slide it in and out, I explained, drawing a simple design on a sheet of paper and gesturing in the air. But all Ingo did was frown hard. It was hard to visualize something you knew so little about, and that only got worse when you had to make it. We're using a screw-based design like most presses right now, but printing will be a lot easier if we can utilize the principle of leverage, I continued. It's just that I don't fully understand how leverage is utilized or how to make a design with it. It'll be easier if we utilize what now? I wrote out an explanation in my diptych describing the points of effort, load, and so on, but Ingo just shook his head in confusion. It seemed that we were still having trouble making fundamental improvements to the design. I can manage this pushing stand thing, but wood's real heavy. We need to use metal so that we can get it sliding smoothly, right? Ingo asked. Correct. Using metal for parts of the printing press will increase both its speed and stability. Shall I discuss this matter with my smithy? If we wanted to use metal for its strength and ease of use, then our best option would be to bring Johann and Zach into this. Plus, Zach had designed a ton of rollers back when we were making the wax stencils. There was a chance that he would be able to make designs for the press based on just my explanation too. Alright, now I know you've got a much, much better printing press than that head of yours. It's just so complicated that nobody else gets what you're saying. I think I'm going to have to speak with those smiths of yours. They're craftsmen who have done work with you before, yeah? Yes, they both came of age recently, and they have completed many jobs for me in the past. I consider them proud members of the Gutenbergs, each essential to the spread of the printing industry, I said in a proud tone. Ingo's eyes immediately sparkled with interest. The gathering of the Gutenbergs, oh god. Really? Are you still doing that with the stupid Gutenberg title? Only person who really wanted it was Zach. Everybody else hated it. Actually, no, I take that back. The only people who wanted it were Zach and Heidi. Everybody else was embarrassed by it. The gathering of the Gutenbergs. Having decided to include metal in the printing press to help with Ingo's improvements, I asked Benno to bring Johann and Zach with him next time. Are you sure about this, Ingo? Benno asked in disbelief, despite the fact that calling over Johann and Zach was nothing unusual for me. It was apparently exceedingly unusual for a smithy to be involved in the design process of a job given to a carpentry workshop. Under normal circumstances, since it was the carpentry workshop doing the job, they would design the product themselves and only contact the smithy to order the required parts. The problem is, I only deal with wood, so I don't know how the metal should be used here. The best thing to do would be to get an expert involved from the start, so that all that matters is making a product that satisfies our customer, the High Bishop. Ingo replied firmly, announcing that he was willing to collaborate with a craftsman from another field, something which was nigh unprecedented. I mean, it shouldn't be, considering that many items in that world probably could be made better or be created entirely by craftsmen working together from different fields. Is it not normal for people from different fields to share their opinions, I asked? We order nails and hinges from smiths when making furniture and doors, but we never talk to people from other fields when making the design. In fact, we don't even talk to other workshops. If we did, There'd be conflict over who was actually given the job and who should earn the money from it, Ingo explained. I can imagine that the whole exclusive business stuff had been established for similar reasons. Guess I can't expect a noble like you to know too much about craftsmen, though, huh? He continued, giving a shrug and shaking his head. I can see Benno and Let's glaring at me from behind him as if to say, but she should know by now. Sorry, Ingo, I wasn't even raised a noble and I still don't know. My dad was a soldier, and my mom and sister were employed by workshops. They weren't involved with the giving and taking of jobs. Though maybe it was possible that I was just so obsessed with making books that I hadn't bothered to learn anything about how the world actually worked. In that case, I will try to think of as many possible improvements as I can, I said. Yeah, thanks. Once Ingo was gone, I tried to remember as much as I could about printing presses, writing down every improvement that came into mind. It was all notes and doodles since I couldn't form an actual schematic, but I hoped that it would at least help them to come up with some ideas. Ingo returned to my chambers a few days later, this time joined by Johann and Zach, who were looking all over the place. Johann just looked scared of what might happen to him, but Zach was curious and obviously looking for anything neat that might be lying about. And so I have summoned you both because I would like to use metal to improve the printing presses. Your assistance will be needed, I explained. Johann nodded at once, but Zach furrowed his brow. I understand the circumstances, but this is a job you give it to a carpentry workshop, he said. It's not a job for my workshop, so what's in it for me? I mean, I do intend to pay you, I responded, but Zach shook his head. Money isn't the only problem here. Helping other workshops won't raise our standing in the smithing guild. That's why Johann's reputation is so poor. All he does is help other people with their work without getting many jobs for himself. Those he helps and their workshops get a reputation boost for a job well done, but Johann's own reputation doesn't improve at all. I don't want to end up in that situation too, Zach explained, thus teaching me why Johann's reputation was so poor, despite the quality of his work. You say that it won't help your reputation, but is that really true? It should benefit both your and Johann's reputation if the metal parts are ordered through your smithing workshops. Or at least that's what Ingo has told me. The order for the printing press had been given to Ingo's workshop, and the orders for the metal parts will be given to Zach and Johann's workshops. It wouldn't be that much different from a normal job, but maybe I was wrong about that. I mean, yeah, as long as you're paying for each of the parts that you're paying for, you're still getting the job done with both of the workshops, and they're still getting money. I glanced at Ingo, but he nodded to reassure me that I was in fact right. But Johann's way better at me at precision work, Zach murmured, giving the roller that had been used for the wax paper as an example. The machine that Johann had made was definitely a lot easier to use, and I knew that Zach had been beyond frustrated that he could not create the machine that he himself had designed. It was frustration born from an understanding of just how superior Johann's smithing ability was. The orders for the parts are all going to go to Johann. It's not going to help my reputation at all, Zach concluded, lowering his gray eyes at the thought that all the work would be stolen away. Zach had shown his designs to Johann in the past, thinking that he would never be able to make them, but now that he knew this was not the case, he was extremely on guard. But that was a problem for me. By having them on guard around each other and refusing to work together, it will be harder to create new inventions. And I was relying on Zach's creativity to turn my vague explanations and wishes into concrete form. Excuse me. Johann may be superior when it comes to making parts, but you are overwhelmingly better at coming up with ideas and designing schematics, Zach. I am relying on your creativity to improve the printing press. Will your reputation improve if I buy the schematics through your smithy? Zach's eyes widened in surprise. Buy the schematics? The heck are you thinking? They're not a product, he said, so surprised that he stopped using polite language entirely. I myself was hit by a wave of culture shock. Buying designs and schematics apparently wasn't normal here. You would be thinking of the schematics, would you not? I want to create the product, so it only makes sense that the schematic would have value. I would thus like to buy your schematics. Surely that would help your reputation, no? So in other words, you want to order a schematic from me and then buy it. Lady Rosemont, you sure say some ridiculous things sometimes. I mean, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, that's done more in Japan. That's done a lot in our world, but I guess not in their world. Zach replied, blinking in surprise a few times before dismissively waving his hands. I really didn't understand what was so strange about it. Johann, seeing me cock my head, clapped a hand on Zach's shoulder with all the confidence of someone who had experienced this exact thing many times before. Zach, it's not just sometimes that Lady Rosemont says ridiculous things, it's all the time. His voice then dropped to a murmur. Better this than her launching into a prayer out of nowhere. I pursed my lips in response, but Zach's gray eyes gleamed as he watched us. Schematics are made during discussions with the customers, and the schematics are never sold since they are only used during the production stage, he said. If a customer wants something you've made in the past, they'll be introduced to your workshop by whoever you made it for. So you don't sell the schematics to other workshops either. I never thought about selling schematics before, but you order one and buy it, and that will definitely help my reputation. And so we agreed that I would buy the schematics from Zach through Benno, which secured his assistance in improving the printing press. What do you want me to improve then? Zach asked once we had gotten all that in order. Our current printing press model is made entirely of wood. Well, we were hoping to start using metal parts for their strength and ease of use, I said, spreading out my notes covered in writing and drawings of everything I could remember. First, I would like a movable stand like this for the press. I would want to be able to put the form on it and then place the paper here. I would then lock this board after folding it and move it under the printing press like this. I pointed at various illustrations and gestured with my hands as I explained. Zach was mumbling something as he listened while Johann was watching with a serious look on his face. At the bare minimum, I would like to incorporate metal so that it slides smoother. Well, I can do that, Johann said with a relieved look, but Zach's gray eyes were gleaming with determination. The bare minimum? What's the best case scenario then? We would ideally be able to move the stand by turning a handle in a circle, but is that too hard to picture, I asked, trying to aid my description by turning an invisible handle in the air. Zach crossed his arms and fell into thought. Moving the stand with a handle? There should be a way to move the stand in the same way that you would turn a spool of thread. Is that comparison at all helpful? A spool of thread, huh? Everything's coming together, he said, which implied that he had thought up an idea of some kind. I would expect nothing less from the creative genius that was Zach. He truly was worthy of his Gutenberg title. As I waited for Zach to finish putting his thoughts together, Ingo looked at me with his bright blue eyes. Is there anything else, High Bishop? Putting aside whether they're actually feasible, if you have any more ideas for improving the printing press, or anything else that you'd want me to make for that matter, just let me hear them. But despite his enthusiasm, it was hard for me to imagine that he would understand any of my explanations. You really don't mind me saying anything that comes to mind? I can't imagine everything I suggest will be possible to make, I replied. It's not about whether it's possible or not. A single word of yours might make me realize that there's something we can do, like what just happened with Zach. There could always be something else I can do, so just say anything that comes to mind, Ingo said. Zach gave a firm nod of agreement, before looking at me with eyes full of anticipation. If that was their attitude, then I decided that I might as well be unreasonable and suggest improvements that may have actually been impossible to make. Very well, in that case, please consider using springs as well. Using what? They're these little metal coils that I'm sure smiths use. They look like this, I said, drawing one and explaining how it was used. At that point, Johann clapped his hands together. Oh, right, springs. How would they be used in the printing press, though? I have no idea. What? Johann explained, looking at me with shock. What did he want me to say? I had read books about the history of the printing press and how it had been improved over time, but it wasn't like they contained detailed blueprints. And even if they had, I wouldn't have remembered the precise details after such a long time. All I know is that they help with moving the printing plate up and down to apply pressure. How they are used in the future printing press, or whether they will even be used at all, are decisions that I entrust to the both of you. The springs will be convenient if implemented properly, but they don't absolutely have to be included. All I could do was list things that I remember from history, and I had no doubts that there were all sorts of minor improvements I didn't know about. But if they could take my advice and actually figure out how to implement it into the printing press, then we would be able to leap 1 or maybe 200 years ahead in printing history. But I just thought it would be nice if we could. It wasn't essential by any means. Oh, also, there's one more thing, I began. There's still more? Zach exclaimed, his eyes up wide open. I didn't know why he and Ingo looked so shocked when they had specifically told me to say everything that came to mind. This will require changing the printing press on a fundamental level, so it doesn't need to happen immediately. Right now, the press is dependent on screws, since it's based on the juice squeezer. But a future printing press would ideally just use the principle of leverage. Right, that thing you mentioned before, Ingo said, his brow furrowed as he remembered not having understood this last time I mentioned it. I once again explained how leverage worked, just as I had previously done with Ingo. When I explained that it was probably being used for things like construction, and provided a few examples, everyone finally nodded in understanding. I get what you're talking about, but I have no idea how it could be useful in a printing press, Johann admitted with a shrug, but Zach shook his head with gleaming eyes. The hell are you saying? This is brilliant. You can move huge things with only a small amount of force. Moving the plate requires the most energy for the printing press we have now, right? If we can get them to move using less force, operating the press will be way easier. And the same design could be used for a lot more than just printing presses, right? Zach raved enthusiastically. Your creativity is as impressive as I expected, Zach. As you say, we can use both leverage and springs in other inventions as well. I would personally like for beds to be made using springs, but the printing press comes first. The printing press always comes first. Books were more important than a comfortable mattress to sleep on. They could use leverage and springs to make other things once the printing press was done, but they could do that without me. In any case, I'll try drawing up some schematics. You will buy them, right? Zach asked, looking a bit uncertain. Of course, I shall send an order to your workshop for printing press schematics, and then I will buy all of the ones I like, I reassured him. Zach's expression quickly became one that made it clear that he was deep in thought. It seemed his mind was already overflowing with ideas. Seeing that, Ingo let out a heavy sigh. Whew, you young'uns sure are impressive. I didn't understand a word of what the High Bishop was saying. Johann and Ingo, you can leave all the creative designing work to Zach. All you need to do is pick the most feasible printing press from his designs and actually make it. It's all about leaving the right job to the right person, I said proudly, puffing out my chest. Johann let out a sigh and shook his head. Is there even a need to improve the printing press right now when you're only making picture books anyway? If we don't finish the printing press now, it'll be a problem for us later, won't it? What are you even saying, Johann? A proper Gutenberg should never say something like that. Johann responded by giving me a look that screamed, I don't want to be a Gutenberg! But I simply ignored it. He was a Gutenberg, and that was that. Ingo and Johann, I have another request for the two while Zach is busy making the schematics, I said. I held out some blueprints. I went ahead and ordered type cases and a typesetting stand from Ingo, as well as composing sticks and some interline spacers. Type cases and a typesetting stand, and what's a composing stick? A type case is a box for putting metal letter types into, designed to account for the quantity of each type and the frequency with which it's used, I explained. The typesetting stand is what the types are set into, named as such because this process is called typesetting. You fit the letter types case here, put the manuscript on here, and then typeset them like so. Ingo nodded, but what about the stick and the interline spacers? They're a lot smaller than the case and stands. The composite stick is a long, thin box used to line up the letter types. You made one for me before, remember? I do, but I had no idea what it was being used for. The composing stick was open on one side, so it technically wasn't a complete box. It was about 5 or 6 centimeters wide, and as long as the short side of an A4 sheet of paper, making it easily holdable in one hand, and it was used to assemble the letter types into words and lines. These types would be lined up on the stick on top of the typesetting stand. If you put the letter types into the composing stick, then what's the interline spacer for? It's a thin board that you put into the composing stick first. It marks the length of a line and keeps the spaces between each line consistent, I explained. It was a bit shorter in height than the letter type so as to not interfere with printing. Its length was used to govern the length of a line, and its width was used to determine the space between each line. It was important to have multiple copies of the same interline spacers since they were always placed between consecutive lines. Ingo, since your workshop was capable of making numerous boards of the same size for winter handiwork, you should be able to make interline spacers as well, right? It's surprisingly hard to keep everything the same size. It's good practice for the apprentices, but... Ingo trailed off and simply accepted the job, but Johann was looking at the design documents with his reddish-brown eyes narrowed. I had ordered some white spaces and setting rules from him, but I didn't think either would be too hard to make. Johann, is there something you don't understand? Lady Rosewine, what's a setting rule? It seems to be a really thin piece of metal. That is correct. Once you put the interline spacers into the composing stick, you tightly press the setting rules against them. It'll help the letter types to move more smoothly, I explained. In order to accomplish this, each setting rule had to be a thin, flat piece of metal. My hopes were fully placed in Johann's talents. Also, haven't I already made a lot of these blank letter types? You have made spaces, but you haven't made quads or justifiers yet, have you? Plus, we'll need furniture at some point if we're going to make a book that only contains words. Spaces were for creating a thin gap between words. These spaces weren't full width themselves, and quads were used at the end of lines when you needed 2 letters or more worth of space. We had just been using a bunch of spaces in a row thus far, but since quads came in all sorts of varying length, it would be much more efficient to use them for long spaces. And then there were justifiers, which were used to make several consecutive rows of blank space. You could line a few up together if you wanted space for a small illustration, or even fill the entire box with them if you wanted a completely blank page. They were hollow on the inside to make them lighter. Furniture was a typesetting term that didn't refer to house furniture as one might assume at first glance. Rather, they were blank spaces even larger than the justifiers used for when you wanted multiple blank pages, such as for a big illustration or a 2-page spread. They would also be important for making top and bottom margins. We haven't needed them before now, since picture books only have a fraction of the pages of normal books, but they'll be necessary once we move on to adult books that are packed with text. And since we'll need a lot, it's better that we start preparing them now rather than later. The deadline is quite far away, but building the printing press will start midway through it. So the sooner you can finish them, the better. You sure like to plan ahead, Johann said, scratching his head and clutching the schematics close to his chest. I mean, it's best to plan ahead when you're doing something this gigantic. About 10 days later, Benno sent another letter. Zach had finished his schematics. I sent back a positive reply, and they once again arrived on the scheduled day, with Zach holding 7 boards of schematics. He was wearing the grin of someone who had just tasted success. Ingo and Johann were with them too. Now then, Zach. I shall examine these schematics you have brought, I said, rifling through them until I found a printing press closest to the one in my memories. This is it. Can you make this? It's the closest one to the press I know. Incredible, Zach. I can't believe you would make something so close to the original with my terrible explanations. As I continued piling my praise onto Zach, he looked over at the schematics with a confident grin and started showing me what modifications he had made and why he had made them. It seemed he also paid close attention to the improvements that the Grey Priest had requested, having heard them from Ngo and Gil. His care and attention to detail made it clear why he had so many customers. Hold on a second, Lady Rosemine. This one uses leverage, so it's a lot more impressive, Johann said, examining the boards and picking up a different one. Are you purposefully looking for the hardest one to do? All you care about is the one that requires the most precision, Zach exclaimed. Johann grimaced for a second, but then he pointed at the board with a gleam in his eye. I can do it. I can make this one, he said firmly. Alright, listen up, you three. Calm down and wait just a second, Ingo said, spreading out his hands to stop us. I looked up at him, blinking in surprise, and he scratched his head awkwardly while looking over us. First up, Zach, I really didn't think you'd make so many schematics and such clever ones, too. You did good. I never would have been able to make schematics like these. Well, it's my job, and what I'm best at. Zach said with an embarrassed smile at the explicit praise. Ingo smiled back, then looked at me with a small frown. Hi, Bishop. You picked that one because it's the closest to what you're used to, but you should look over the others for their strengths and weaknesses. I get that you're happy, but you gotta calm down a bit. Yeah. I glared at Benno and Lex, who were stealthily grinning at me for being scolded, and then reached out to the other schematics. And finally, Johann, as a craftsman, it's important to want to test yourself on hard jobs, but aren't you thinking of which design will actually be best? Which will satisfy the customer the most? That's what's most important when it comes to making a product, not showing off your skills. Sorry, Johann mumbled. After Ingo's lecture, we all went back to looking over the boards. We discussed removing some parts, adding others, and modifying parts of the designs while Zach redrew the schematics over and over again. The result was a blueprint for a fairly advanced printing press. There wasn't much doubt that we had managed to advance printing technology 200 years in a single day. There's going to be a lot of work to do over the winter, the craftsman said, eyes gleaming with motivation to get this printing press made. They were all patting each other on the back and saying they would get it done by spring no matter what. May my Gutenbergs be blessed by Mestinora, the goddess of wisdom. Okay, I'm going to have to end this off here. I'll see everybody next time.